Welcome everybody to the Vienna Whyte Roundtable Season 1, Episode 4. I'm your host,
Hi.
MILLIE ROUGE. And today we have our guests. I'll let you guys all kind of go around and say your name nice and loud and just so that the camera will pick up on you.
Okay, so my name is Benjamin Williams, and I'm an entertainer here in Edmonton. I'm a member of John Hewitt and the New Americans, as well as Angie and the Inclines. And I also do some solo work as a cover artist.
Hey, I'm Kaeley Jade. I'm a local musician and an actor and a visual artist here in Edmonton.
Hello, I'm Renelle Ray Samard, and a local musician as well. And from the Edmonton area, Franco-Albertan, so French and English stuff, and yeah.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, welcome guys. Thank you for being a part of our show today. Today's
Thanks for having
topic,
us.
yeah, absolutely. Today's topic that we're going to be chatting about is actually I think this has been like the most fun category I've came up with on my own so far. So we are going to talk about the different decades of music. So we're really going to kind of throw it back and talk about different genres. I know a lot of us haven't obviously lived through like the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, but to the best of your knowledge, I want to kind of get your guys' opinions on kind of your favorite music genres that you've listened to. So to start it off, I'm going to ask you guys, what is your favorite decade of music? So what decade is maybe your favorite music that you've listened to? So whoever wants to chime in first, feel free. The floor is open.
Well, I think for me, like my parents, we grew up in the house with a lot of like 70s, 80s kind of stuff. So I think that's for sure up there with me. Lots of ABBA, lots of like Simon and Garfunkel, lots of Queen and stuff. So
Really
AC/DC, my dad's a really big fan. So it's kind of nice having like a whole range of things to inspire me growing up.
Beautiful. How about you, Renelle?
I would say kind of the same thing, more 80s, 70s, 80s, anywhere from Johnny Cash, Ray Charles, a lot of Motown. Grew up loving that, and
Cool.
and
Got like the funk kind of funk
kind of
vibe
funk
to you.
soul stuff, and
Ooh.
yeah.
Cool. And Ben, what about you?
I hate to be a little bit of a purist, but Simon and Garfunkel and Motown are more 60s. Just letting you guys know that right now. But those are great choices and great influences. The 1960s, I would have to say, are probably my favorite decade of music that inspires me the most. Especially, when you think of, Simon and Garfunkel, Paul Simon and his writing, I think in a subconscious way have been a huge influence on the way that I even perceive music. For the 60s, the Beach Boys are probably my favorite band of all time from the 60s, or who had the most prominence in the 60s. The Beatles, of course. Different one-hit wonders from the 60s, still kind of ring true in my mind. A lot of soul singers, Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, stuff of that ilk. But what inspires me the most, it's probably stuff throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s kind of sort of thing. So like,
Cool.
I'm big on the 70s as well. John Denver got me inspired to start singing and take it seriously in general, and Gordon Lightfoot's a huge influence on my performance. And my favorite rock band of all time is Supertramp, who were big in the 70s and 80s, and all that kind of stuff. So it'd be
Beautiful.
1960 to 1980, or maybe 1990 if you wanted to throw in some Traveling Wilburys or Tom Petty, or later George Harrison or Roy Orbison or something like that.
This guy knows his stuff about about the decades of music, so he'll have lots
Unfortunately,
to say.
I do. Yes.
No, that's awesome. I love it. What decade do you think has had the biggest influence on like the world as a general? I know it's kind of like a huge question, but in your opinion, what decade do you think really had a huge influence for like maybe the music industry itself?
I volunteer as last because I'm going to need to think about this.
Okay. Ladies, what do you think? What kind of decade do you think had like the most influential? Like, I know all of them really have a huge influence, but what do you guys think maybe has been the biggest one as of yet?
Um, I guess the correction of it being in the 60s, I'd say if it was more Motown when that skyrocketed, because it was something that wasn't really talked about. They had their struggles in the way that they overcame with everything, and I don't know, Diana Ross, Lionel Richie, things like that, of just making a statement, and Michael Jackson, you know, King of Pop, and Whitney Houston, Queen of Pop. I mean, it just was, I mean, bigger than anything, in my opinion. But I mean, that's just with technology and things really starting up.
Yeah,
You know,
starting to really amp up. Yeah, and I think it really had an influence on like people of color, as well as, like you said, like
Absolutely.
technology. I think, yeah, that's absolutely totally, in your opinion, I think that I also agree with that too. What do you think, Kaeley? What would you say has been the biggest influence so far, like decade wise?
Decade wise, I mean, like it's hard because I feel like art and politics usually are hand in hand with things that are going
Totally.
on. So it's kind of hard to be like, hey, this one decade was more influential, because things are like changing so much all the
All the
time,
time. Yeah.
politically and like culturally. So it's, yeah, everything kind of reinforces each other, I think. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah, it's a hard question. That's why I wanted to ask it, because
know.
I don't even have an answer to it, to be honest with you. And Ben, did you think of a time that has been the most influential? Or are you still thinking on it?
I have actually, and a little bit to Kaylee's point, where she made the correlation between art and politics.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really interesting point, because the way I think about it, after World War II, the world was never the same in a lot of ways, especially given you know, how closely the Western world had to work together militarily as well as economically to get through such a hardship. Um,
Yeah.
and then post World War II, you know, just as the Great Depression had technically ended, you know, people, you know, took more to celebrating through the arts, much like they did in the Roaring Twenties with jazz.
Yes.
But I'd like to say, you know, probably the biggest decade that still has the biggest impact on music today, I would argue, would be the 1950s. And the
Cool.
reason I say that is because this was when, you know, a lot of the I guess the teeny boppers who really didn't fight in World War II, but kind of grew up as like young children when the war was kind of ending,
Mm-hmm.
kind of sort of thing. They just, you know, they were kind of like sort of indirect byproducts of the, you know, unfolding boomer generation,
Yeah.
baby boomers.
Baby boomers. Yeah.
Um, and you know, you can't really you can't really discredit the influence of an artist like Elvis Presley on people
Yeah.
who would come to follow him, you know. And you know, it's not just Elvis Presley either who really inspired the Beatles and a bunch of other people down the line. You know, they hail him as king, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
But I would argue there's a guitarist, a rock guitarist who was very iconic. He died a few years ago at the age of about 92. Rest in peace. His name is Chuck Berry.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck Berry had a bunch of great R&B and sort of bluesy, rocky hits. You know, he's known best for Johnny Be Good. You know, he had Roll Over Beethoven, which the Beatles covered, and a song called Sweet 16, which actually serves as the basis for one of the Beach Boys' most popular hits, Surfin' USA, because of the format of da 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 da. Da, 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 da. Like it almost uses the same format, and it almost plagiarizes the song.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but like if Chuck Berry, and you know, Chuck Berry and his guitar playing influenced so many people. It influenced John Lennon and George Harrison's playing
Yeah.
of the Beatles. It influenced Carl Wilson of the Beach Boys and a bunch of different other guitarists down the line. I'm sure as hell that it inspired Eric Clapton and Steve
Yeah.
Winwood and anybody
Just
else
kind
who
of a
would
chain
be
effect.
absolutely, and anybody
Yeah.
else who would consider themselves like a rock guitarist owes a great
Yeah.
debt of gratitude to Chuck Berry, and anybody who considers himself a rock and roll artist owes a great debt of gratitude, I believe, to Elvis Presley, and
Yeah.
maybe even further back to the 40s when groups like the Ink Spots were popular. You know, the group that kind of did Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. And
So glad you're clarifying this, because I wouldn't know half the songs.
Fair enough. You know,
I
most
appreciate
don't.
it.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
You know, and you know, with just as a side note, I believe Hound Dog, the Elvis tune, was originally written by a woman named Sister Rosetta Tharpe. If I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong.
That sounds familiar. I feel like I've definitely heard that before.
Yeah, and you know, she was a woman of color, and these were before the days of the civil rights movement, when women of color really didn't have any sort of platform artistically. Before the 50s and 60s, and I would like to argue, you know, with Chuck Berry and other I guess R&B groups that were prominent in the 50s, like the Drifters with Ben E. King, who did Stand By Me solo in the 60s. You know, artists like that made a way for Berry Gordy to create the Motown label, to kind of give more prominence to artists like the Jackson 5 and Stevie Wonder, and artists like that went to be massive legends in their own right afterwards. So my general synopsis is that the 1950s were probably the most significant decade for popular music in modern history.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, because I took a class that, Benjamin, I think you could be a great professor for. It was called History of Pop, but they really went all over through the different decades. And it's actually a very interesting class, but a lot of the like classic legends that you've listed were the artists that we talked about. We talked about like the different, like the political stuff going on during the time, but a lot of the things that you mentioned were pretty accurate. But I think every answer that everyone has said has been pretty actually like down the line. But I think for sure, I don't know if like the jazz era had, I mean, obviously it does have a massive effect, but I think, yeah, you guys are right. Like kind of after the 50s, that's when music really had that big influence.
Well, if I could just comment on that. Well, jazz kind of had its place in time, and now jazz is more of a niche sort of kind of genre. Not saying it's good or bad, it just has its own niche.
It is very different from like rock and roll and metal. It definitely has its place, like you said.
Yeah, and I actually like to give a bit of a shout out to Renelle for listing Lionel Richie. He actually was a very important writer and artist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, not just as an artist himself or in the Commodores, but a very important writer. He wrote, he actually wrote a song that Kenny Rogers, rest in peace, made famous in the 1980s called Lady. And that's a fantastic song that was written by Lionel Richie. And, you know, Lionel Richie wrote so many other great songs that he himself didn't even write. And another group, actually, that wrote a lot of songs for other people, like Dionne Warwick and Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, believe it or not, the Bee Gees, Barry Gibb, Robin Gibb, and Maurice Gibb. You know, and they're famous for the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and stuff like that. You know, with Staying Alive and How Deep Is Your Love and stuff like that. They actually wrote a lot of different songs for other people. And I've always admired writers, you know, and you could list off people like, I guess, like in more folk or country or Americana, like Steve Earle, and kind of sort of like, you could even put Chris Stapleton in the same category, because before he even became famous for his version of Tennessee Whiskey, he was a Hustle in Nashville writer.
Yeah,
so
they've all got their starts. I have a few more. I have actually like a few more questions, so I don't want to shorten you, Ben, but we've got a lot of questions to go through.
I knew this would happen. It's okay.
No, that's all good. Don't worry about it. Okay, my Zoom meeting is saying I have 10 minutes left, which shouldn't be right. So what I'm going to do is when I get closer to time, I'm going to stop the recording and then just invite you guys all back in, okay? Just so you guys have a heads up. What decade would you guys erase completely from existence if you had the ability to? I know it's a tough question because it feels like it's personal, but it's not personal.
I mean, if I don't think any of them work without the other. I think they build on each other, and I think taking one out would have taken out the color of what builds on what. I mean, I guess jazz is its own niche, but when you combine, like they all kind of meet with each other, and it would be hard to pick one to take out. I mean, that's like,
Feels wrong.
you know, like let's take out a country. Let's pick a country that we're less a fan of. I mean, you can't. It kind of, for me anyway. I don't know if there's. I mean, screamos particularly not my forte. And opera, I appreciate them. I appreciate them. I, however, wouldn't take them out. I think everything works with the other. Builds on top. And I mean, that's a tough question. If someone can actually pick one to take out, I'm anxious to see the reasoning behind it.
Yeah. What do you think, Kaeley?
I don't know. I mean, like, 2000 stuff. I don't know. I mean, like, can I go like farther back in time and say like 1250 or something? Although, I mean, I'm sure that was also very important.
Yeah, they'll just take out like the rocks and the music they made.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I
to
love
hell
it.
with corporate rock.
Yeah. Benjamin, do you have a genre? Well, not a genre. A decade you would take out?
This is a much harder question than what I think is the most important decade. Just because, everything is kind of sort of intertwined in its own way, and music kind of doesn't know decades. Especially now, because
kind of blends
nowadays, because there's lots of people like me who don't really have don't take that much of a liking to modern pop music now. There's a huge renaissance of music that sounds like the days of old, whether that means it's the 2000s, whether that means the 90s, whether it's the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s. You see it all now with, especially, more underground-ish, more indie sort of artists that really want to, I guess sound different, or they want to sound like they want to sound. And keep in mind, I hate the use of the word artist because I think it gives musicians, singers, and performers an overinflated sense of importance sometimes. But, it's unfortunate that, the word artist is the most accurate term you can really use to kind of put it all together, So I use that word as carefully as I can.
Yeah.
But, in answer to the question, if I can try and keep it short, I would probably pick the 1930s if I had to go with a decade, simply because of the stock market crash of October 1929 and the resulting Great Depression that followed, and the advent of technology. There was nothing like this. With what we're going through with COVID-19 right now. There was no live streaming, there was no cell phones, there was none of this technology that we now in this current generation have at our disposal. There was none of that. So I would say the 1930s, because there basically wasn't that much going on anyways. If anything, it was more poor rural class people, or maybe richer people, or I don't know, I don't know if there was really that much of an economic or industrial structure to music in the 30s, or before that anyways, before, music became super commercialized in the 50s. But I'd erase the 30s because there just wasn't that much going on. And if there was very much going on, it probably wasn't that good because there was not very much to work with. That being said, though, I got to be careful about that because if I'm not mistaken, I believe a very influential blues artist came out of the 30s named Robert Johnson, who wrote a song, I went down to the crossroads, got down on my knees.
Robert Johnson, I'm pretty familiar with him too, so I think you're right.
So if you erase him out of history, I believe that we would be so far behind. So I say that with very much caution, and if anything, I would probably change the question. Not that I would totally erase what happened. I would have it be redone, because I believe that back in those days, the cream always rose to the top. And, you would still get the likes of Robert Johnson and people that I don't really recall from that era because there really wasn't much going on. But Robert Johnson would always stick out. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's my synopsis on that.
No, I like it. I actually find that very interesting that you mentioned the 30s, because I think that would be kind of my guess too, because like Renelle said, there is a lot of like, if you kind of take one out, it would have a huge impact. And I think obviously, yeah, if you take out the 30s, it might have like a slight impact, but definitely not as huge as something like the 50s, the 60s, the 70s for sure. So I like that. What I'm going to quickly do is I'm going to end the Zoom because it's getting close to that like 2-minute mark. And then I'm guys for doing that. I just want to make sure we get all of the essence of you guys while you're here. So my next question is, if you guys could have lived through any decade of music, what decade would you choose to live through? Now, I'm just talking about strictly living through, not being a musician this decade, just listening to the music and just enjoying as a regular audience. What decade would you choose to listen to? Whoever wants to go first, jump right into it.
I wouldn't change a thing. I would
Like
be
the decade.
now.
Oh.
I would be existing in the 2020s. The reason being
Cool.
because being a musician is all I've ever been.
Mm-hmm.
And if I weren't a musician, I would not be who I am. So
Cool.
I wouldn't change a thing. That's the easiest question. Next.
You're like, done. Boom.
Yeah.
What do you ladies think?
It's hard. I feel like, man, being a young person through disco would be insane, but being a young person in the 80s would be great, like all the clubs and the rise of the music video and like things like that, and like the 60s with the Beatles and all of the like the fan clubs
Fangirling
that kind of started to pop up in that time, like with Elvis. Like I think like that's hard to pick a specific decade because there's so many exciting things that were happening with like each decade and like with new groups and super fans and like things like that. So it's hard to be like this one.
Yeah, totally. I think for
disco
myself,
maybe be cool. Disco would be pretty cool.
Well, I think for myself, like any decade with dancing, like where dancing was more like less seen as like twerking on each other, would be like the coolest decade to live through. So I agree with the disco kind of era. I think like in that kind of time frame, I think that would have been really cool. What do you think, Renelle?
Yeah, I agree. I'm a big dancer, so I'd love that. But I'd say like where all the scatting was happening, jukebox, like all that kind of vibe, and the long poofy dresses. I mean, it just be fun. Even jazz. I think when that first started up, I'd pick a few. I think I would try and rent a car or rent a buggy or rent a horse and go from time to time and dance.
Just go through all of it.
I could,
That's amazing.
That would be
it.
Flash to flash. It would take a long time.
Yeah, totally. And I actually think, I know this is kind of like really throwing it back, but like the Renaissance era would be very interesting because the music was very classical. But it'd be interesting because I know they were very into like the era of like dancing and like, not that I necessarily like to like waltz with people, but I just think it'd be really cool to just like experience that. But
although you're saying that you'd be like a rich person in the Renaissance.
True. I wouldn't be
folk music.
Wow.
I would not want to be a peasant during that time because that would not be as fun.
I mean, like I'm sure there's lots of like folk music, but like all that, all the dance kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love that.
Wow. I just gotta say, that's one thing a lot of people don't realize about classical music of like the 15, 16, 17, 1800s is there like there was a lot of aristocracy involved. Yeah. And rich folk and royalty were literally patrons of artists of that ilk. And the reason I know that is because all of my musical training is classically related. I'm a classical guitarist by, as how I started. I'm a Royal Conservatory music graduate, so I'm naturally aware of the history there, and not a lot of people are. So kudos to Kaeley and MILLIE over here for actually spreading truth.
No, I love it. Which decade of music do you guys think, in your opinion, artists made the most income? Out of all the decades, and I know that's kind of hard to say because we haven't been through all the decades, obviously, but what do you think was the decade where people were really financially like doing okay and doing well with? Because I know nowadays the arts doesn't pay a whole lot of money, but what decade do you think maybe really started to make the most income?
All right. I believe that this is a topic that even if I just, pull the numbers out of my carcass, you could probably still back it up.
Yeah.
I'd probably say from the 70s up to about the 90s.
Hmm.
I would think, and it's not just one decade in general, but if anything, it might, like, for musicians
Mm-hmm.
themselves. I would probably say that the 1970s were probably the best, either the 70s or the 80s, because labels at that time invested more in the artists that were signed.
Yeah.
When things turned way, 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 way more corporate than corporate rock ever did, that's when labels started to take more advantage
Mm-hmm.
of the artists that were signed onto the labels and giving them shitty deals, and artists going
Yeah.
into these label contracts, excuse me, with a sense of naivety and not even considering hiring a competent entertainment lawyer to go through all of the pros and cons and nuances of the contracts presented to them, because believe it or not, a lot of artists were you know a lot of artists were scouted like crazy throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, because labels wanted more artists to make more money off of. Because
Yeah.
make no mistake about it, even still today, the entertainment industry, the music industry, the film industry is a big industry. There is money to be made. It's
Yeah.
just that, unfortunately, a lot of us get stuck on the wrong end of it.
Yeah.
Either that, or none of us, or a lot of us, aren't really that business savvy in general, and we think that money will just
Totally.
come when
Yeah.
that's not the case.
Yeah.
In my situation, before life got completely upended for all of us, um, in my situation, the way that I approached it is, I have this going for me, and this seems to be like this element of what I do, as a performer. There's this one element about me, that's that seems to be sort of attractive about my performance when people watch me, and I can capitalize on that. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, I think it's the way that I perform the covers that I do as a solo performer.
Yeah.
So I found that to be very attractive to the people who booked the pubs that I was playing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I got so many pub gigs, and also farmers markets before that, because they saw, a lot of them saw that I had some sort of X factor, and that's just me riding on talent alone. For those who I think those who might have an easier time navigating the industry are actually those with less talent, and those with more business acumen.
Mm-hmm.
Because especially in today's day and age, you got to have some sort of semblance of knowing social media algorithms,
Yeah.
and
Marketing.
being in touch with the kids, kind of sort of thing, especially now that TikTok's such a big thing. You've seen artists like Abso Facto,
Yeah.
and what's his name, a guy called Music by Edgar or something like that,
Mm.
who did some like, I guess, Post Malone-ish sounding songs as kind of more of like a thing to prove how simple it is to create beats like that and sounds like that, but now is kind of becoming a prominent artist in his own right. So I think it's much less about talent, and more so knowing about the market in general. And I think that in the 70s, in terms of answering your question, there was a perfect marriage of talent and marketability with artists, especially in rock and roll, because think about the demographic of the people who are listening to that kind of stuff. People who are not satisfied with the status quo, the establishment, people who were a little bit more liberal in terms of social sort of policy and kind of stuff like that on the political side, and people who are more easygoing.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of corporate rock, it was a little different, but not that much different at the time. But like rock in general, especially when you talk about artists like Grateful Dead, for example, bands like Grateful Dead with Jerry Garcia. A lot of bands and artists like that relied on a demographic of peace-loving, free willy, happy-go-lucky hippies. and labels capitalized on their naivety with their finances
Mm-hmm.
to kind of sort of almost exploit their sort of desire for world peace and stuff like that through the music. That's just on the business side. I'm not speaking to the artistic side
Yeah.
of
Yeah, mainly
that
just
decade.
yeah, totally. Ladies, would you disagree or agree with Ben?
I mean, everyone has their opinion. I mean, I totally agree. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's also looking at it where it's a talent thing, and it's knowing it's more so overwhelming because it becomes something where in this day and age when it is kind of on your own, you're like an auto, you're producing your own stuff, you're doing your own thing. It's either save up and pay people that know what they're doing, or you go to as many formations as you can to learn about this, learn what you need to know. You either try and learn it or you find people that do know it.
Mm-hmm.
And to know that as an artist or musician, artist, whatever, is not offensive or taken lightly or taken heavily, it becomes something where we are overwhelmed thinking that, we got to do everything.
Yeah.
We have to write our own stuff. We can't co-write. We got to really just get the recognition of doing everything on our own. It's still not the case for me anyway, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's really finding a solid group of people that know you, that understand your artistry, that can help you in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes something where the talk of, it's either talent or knowing the biz, it can go in both, or there are a lot of cases where it's this more than that. I mean, it's like anything, but it's to not feel so overwhelmed and to know that you surround yourself with a group of people that can support you. Like Yeg Music, for example, things like that can support local artists and all that, and not feel so on your own and not feel so competitive, because it becomes something where if you're solely trying to get it for fame or trying to be discovered, I mean, it's each to their own, but for me, it's really the love of music. But if I think about it logically, it's, okay, what's my income? Am I making enough money to support this? Is this a dream? It's okay to be a dream. It's okay to have a plan B, a plan A. It's okay to have all these plans to support it. And especially being a musician, it becomes something where you think I'm a musician. I'm solely a musician. And then people that ask me, well, you're going to school to be a music teacher, so you're not really just a musician. And it's like, yes, I am, but I'm also finding a way to make money. Why? Because I'm producing my own stuff, paying for my own stuff to make the music, to share the music, and it's not just something where that's all I'm doing and I'm so into it. I can so be into it and have different things that help me get there and help fund it. It becomes so expensive. And
Absolutely.
I don't know, it's one without the other. It's everybody has their own deal on that, but I think it becomes overwhelming when as an artist, because especially when you're picked up by a label or something, you can just be the artist. You don't have to worry business, you don't have to worry management and all that. But when you're your own everything, becomes something where you can say, okay, look, pay this person to make your website because they know what to do, or find a way to learn it, do tutorials. Like, it just kind of find what you're good at, like Ben was saying, find your niche and what you excel in, and then the rest, either learn it or you surround yourself with people that know how to do it, so.
Absolutely. I want to move on to the next question because we have a few questions left. So this one's kind of interesting. If Bach or Beethoven, doesn't really matter who you decide, came back to life today, they rose from the dead, they just rocked up and they were alive, what do you think they would have to say about modern music nowadays? What would be their opinion, or what do you think they would say about modern music nowadays? Whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
I think at first they would be fairly overwhelmed because, especially if they rose from the dead now, they would have to be they would have to find some way of going through the history of how did this happen? Yeah. And then if they were to find out that they were major catalysts of the evolution of music, then that would be even more overwhelming.
Totally.
So especially given the way that this is just me making a broad assumption. I would say that just the mental faculties of somebody living in the 16th or 17th or 18th centuries, or 15th century, whatever, you know, they were probably not as developed as they are now, given our advancement, or I guess societal or individual evolution throughout the decades. Apart from music, like in sociology and psychology, and economics, and all of that, there's been so much evolution since then that they would also have to process on top of figuring out how the hell did music become what it is. Forget whether they think it's good or not.
Yeah.
Right? Because like art is, at the end of the day, art is subjective. Right?
Yeah.
So I just think at first they would be like overwhelmed beyond proportion.
Totally. What do you ladies think?
Well, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Ben is saying, I think, in that sense. But like, I think there's such a culture that has evolved around music. Like, it's not like you're selling music as a product anymore. Like, you are selling the artists, and you're selling like everything visually too. Like, there's such a visual and performative component nowadays.
Yeah.
Like, there has to be, because like you can't make any money off of like streams or like sales anymore. Like, it has to be your whole package. So like, and so much of that package nowadays is like around like sex. Like, sex still sells. So it's like, I'd be curious to see what they would think about that. Like,
Totally. I think they'd be pretty
like that whole like
Like, what is this humping thing you all do?
like the
Why are
whole
you
like virgin
twerking?
whore complex. It's like, what do they think about that? That's my curiosity.
Hold on. I am 100% sure that they would still understand the sexual component, because that was very strong back in the 15th century. Let me tell you this.
But it wasn't as portrayed. It wasn't something where let's show
was as public.
the bikini look and be
it
naked.
wasn't portrayed, but it was implied. It was implied, given the times and the context of the culture, I would argue.
I think though classical music had it was very proper though. It was very proper, and like it wasn't seen as like a sexual dirty thing. So I do see what you're saying, Ben, but I think they'd be pretty mortified to see that kind of get into the music world, you know?
The portrayal of it nowadays, yes.
Yeah.
I would like to argue though. I would like to argue though, there must have been proper and improper classical music back in the day.
Probably,
like, the way that we look at the classical music of that day now from our current context is much different than how they viewed it back in the day. Much like how a lot of like, you know, GI generation people viewed rock and roll music as Satan's music back when, you know, teeny boppers back in the day were bopping to it. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of my former church members, when I was going to church, still believe that rock and roll music is Satanist. Don't know what to say about that. But anyways.
Well, and I think back in the day, if they would ever come back, I mean, Beethoven, it would be something with the sound waves, the vibrations, you know, like thing where thing is with especially women, and it's the whole sex symbol of women nowadays. Back then it was like forbidden, and something where nowadays we're really taking on, and it doesn't have to be sexualized. It's just women taking a stand and finally having the right to express themselves, and
more open.
Who cares in what way? And I mean, people will take offense in that time, and in their own what's the worst way, and then in our day and age, what's the worst, you know? And it's but in regards to music, I think on a piano, whether it's piano, guitar, anything, it's the same piano. It's the same notes. So it's whatever you do with them in between, how you interpret it. I mean, it would be beautiful to see how overwhelmed they'd be with the impact that they gave us.
And how it evolved. Yeah. I think it'd be really cool just to honestly sit them down and be like, here's a dubstep song, and just like walk out the room and be like, there you go, you're welcome. And they'll just be like, I am so confused. But all right, I've got one last question for you guys before we jump off here. Can you pick an artist from any decade that if you could pick any artist or a musician, whatever you want to go by, that you could have dinner with and jam music with? Who would be your pick and why?
My phone's about to die, so I'm probably going to go first.
Oh, okay.
So, right now, at this current moment, I would probably want to have a sit-down dinner with Paul McCartney.
Ooh.
because he's still alive.
Yeah.
And I would like to argue, is one of the greatest composers of, if not the greatest composer of modern times, based on his involvement with the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
I would say second to that, or on par with that, would be Brian Wilson. And Brian Wilson, I slightly like more in terms of his artistic contribution based on the Beach Boys,
Mm-hmm.
but that's my personal preference. But the thing with Brian is he suffers from a plethora of mental disorders, and it's nothing against him. It's just that I feel like I would be a burden on Brian if I were to like sit down and try and have a conversation like this with him, because he can barely speak, like he barely wants to speak in any more than 3 sentences. That's how much his mentality has deteriorated. So I wouldn't want to be that much of a burden. Yeah. But Paul McCartney, at the age of, I believe, 77, turning 78 in June, still as bright as ever, still performs like a freaking monster.
Yeah, he's healthy.
You know, like you watch him play Helter Skelter with his band, and it's just like, what? You see him do I Got a Feeling, and it's just like, what? Like, you know, he's still got it. You know, I just have so much respect for him. Yeah. And, you know, I just want to I don't want to like sit down and interview him. I want to like sit down and like talk with him like I'm making him a friend of mine. Yeah. Right. And just like getting to know the man. Totally. And like talking music and life and stuff like that. You know, Paul McCartney, hands down, is who I would want to have a sit down dinner with.
He would be a super cool guy, and I think to jam with him would be just so much fun. What do you ladies think?
Man, I would love to pick Freddie Mercury's brain. I think that would be like, that'd be so cool, because like I feel like his creative process is like just out of this world.
Crazy.
So I think like getting the chance to really discover like how he created music, and like it'd be really cool. Or you know, I have a very secret love of performing jazz music, and Etta James is one of my favorites ever. So like if I could like sit down with her and just like
drink some wine,
jam, like that'd be very cool.
Excellent
I think
choices.
That would be sweet. Yeah. What about
excellent
you,
choices?
It's solely based on like talent and how does your voice sound like that. It would have to be Whitney Houston for sure, Celine Dion,
rest in peace,
and Adele for our time. I just love everything that she's about. And then for something more in my genre would be Donovan Woods. I think that just to sit down and story tell, and just to find out how, I don't know, just
how they're so amazing.
Wow, great choices. I love all of those people. You know, Freddie would be an absolute fun guy to talk to, 100%. And you know, like with Renelle and her listing at it was Adele and Whitney Houston, right? Oh, I love those singers. So good.
Well, I love your guys' answers. Those are actually really awesome. That unfortunately is all the time we have for today. Once again, thank you so much to all of our guests for being on the show today. I'm MILLIE ROUGE. This has been the Vienna Whyte Roundtable talk. So make sure you guys like and subscribe and hit the bell button down below so you're notified when our shows come out. Our shows come out Monday to Friday daily, so there's always content to watch, new local artists to learn about, and just stuff to talk about. So thank you guys again. I'll let you guys each say your goodbyes, and make sure you say a nice loud goodbye so the screen can pick up on you.
Peace out, homies. Have a good quarantine. And thank you so much for doing this. It keeps us keeps us alive. It's kind of essential to be discussing these things even at home. So thank you.
Totally. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us on here. Like, it's been a real treat this morning to get to connect with other artists. So I'm Kaeley Jade. Have a great day.
Beautiful. And Ben, send us off.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in here. It's been a pleasure to hang out with MILLIE from Vienna Whyte, and to get to see Kaeley Jade again, and to get to meet Renelle Simard. I'm going to be checking you out for sure. My name is Benjamin Williams. Stay safe, stay sane, and as always, stay sanitary.
Beautiful. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.